Welcome to all of those who are joining us. My name is Amie Kreppel, and I'm the director at the UF Center for European Studies and a faculty member in the Department of Political Science. The UF Center for European Studies is both a Jean Monnet Center of Excellence funded by the EU and a Department of Education funded National Resource Center on Europe. A few housekeeping tips or notes before we begin. The discussion today will be recorded and it will be available on the UFCES website shortly after today's event. We will have a Q&A session following the presentations, and we ask that participants submit questions through the Q&A button on the bottom of your screen. When you are submitting questions, please keep them brief, and please also indicate if there is a specific person that you would like to have address your question. Thank you all for joining us. We have a very timely talk today, obviously. This is part of our Europe briefing series. And today we're talking about what the war in Ukraine means. This talk is co-sponsored by the Center for European Studies and the UF Political Science Department. Our panelists will each provide brief remarks to provide some context to the war in Ukraine from a variety of perspectives, but we are hoping to give a good amount of time to a Q&A discussion. And we do want to get to as many of them as possible as time allows. Our panel today includes Dr. Michael Bernhard, who's the Raymond and Miriam Ehrlich Eminent Scholar at UF, Department of Political Science, Dr. Aida Hozic, who is Associate Professor and Associate Chair in the Department of Political Science at UF, Dr. Bryon Moraski, who is an Associate Professor at the UF Department of Political Science, and Dr. Selden, who is an Associate Professor at the UF's Department of Political Science. I'm going to go not quite in alphabetical order. We're going to begin with Professor Moraski, who is going to give us some of the context and background. This will be followed by Professor Hozic, then by Michael Bernhard, and then by Professor Selden. Time allowing, I will follow up with some comments from the EU perspective. And just a reminder, at the end of today's talk, as you're leaving, you'll be taken to an event survey, and we very much appreciate you taking a few minutes to complete that survey as you exit so that we can get feedback and plan for future events. Bryon, you have a presentation, so I'm going to go ahead and pull that up.
Thank you, Amie, and thank you to my fellow panelists and those attending virtually. I will begin with a brief survey of the main considerations driving Russian foreign policy in general and how Ukraine in particular fits into those considerations. I will then outline a few reasons for why Putin may have chosen to act now rather than at some other time. And I'll conclude with a discussion of some possible implications for the region and the world more broadly. Given assertions that Putin is seeking to rebuild the Soviet Union, I think this is probably the best place to start. I think most scholars and many political observers would recognize the political, economic, and psychological challenges associated with losing an empire. Many of Russia's elites and citizens definitely regret the loss of Russia's superpower status, if not the demise of the Soviet Union that occurred with the demise of the Soviet Union. It should not be surprising then that a prevailing foreign policy goal is to establish Russia as a great power. One whose interests other powers from the United States to China must take into consideration. And historically, and this seems to be also driving how the Kremlin interprets history, Russia's great power status has always included control over more territory, most crucially Ukraine. But why? Well, one reason is that the role that such territory plays in promoting state security. Both the Russian heartland during the Russian Empire and the Soviet Union benefited from the presence of buffer states, territory that could be used to keep the enemy at bay. Another reason is that imperial expansion allows the state to acquire more defensible boundaries, like the Caucasus Mountains, and strategically important transportation routes like the Kerch Strait, separating the Black Sea from the Sea of Azov, or the town of Kherson at the end of the Dnipro River, let alone seaports from Sevastopol to Odessa. Ukraine then has been a critical place in Russia's Western Front. So a third major foreign policy issue for Russia may sound like a domestic issue to Westerners, but Western policies of democracy promotion have made it an international issue. From the communist color revolutions, it began with the bulldozer revolution in Serbia, but really swept into the post-communist space, the post-Soviet space with Georgia, Ukraine, and Kyrgyzstan in the early 2000s to the 2011 Arab Spring, and comments from Westerners like the late Senator John McCain about a Russian winter have led the Kremlin to pursue measures that one political analyst has called Putin's counter-revolution. From this perspective, Ukraine's 2004 Orange Revolution and the more recent 2014 Revolution of Dignity really sent powerful signals of what might be possible in Russia. And from the Russian perspective, to think that that's possible from among their quote, little brothers. The final topic that's important for understanding Russian foreign policy and how it relates to Putin's war in Russia is the issue of national sovereignty. On this issue, the West and Russia have such different views that some Russian foreign policy scholars have labeled them as incompatible, right? And thus an inherent and maybe insurmountable source of tension. For the West, national sovereignty is in the ideal preserved for all states, large and small, while also subject to limits. Specifically, the principle of sovereignty ends when the state commits human rights violations against its people. Russia's foreign policy establishment, on the other hand, understands sovereignty as a principle that only the strong enjoy, that is, great powers, and as something that should never be violated. In other words, great powers have inviolable rights to sovereignty, but can violate the sovereignty of smaller powers. Russia sees American intervention around the world as evidence that the West preaches one view of sovereignty and practices another. Okay, with this groundwork laid, I think it's more than clear how important control over Ukraine is to Russia. An important question then is why invade in 2022 and not earlier, such as in 2014? My initial answer is that Russia did invade in 2014. And the current conflict is a consequence of that partially unsuccessful attempt. If you remember, the Russian establishment and pro-Russian separatists were talking about creating a Novorossiya in large parts of eastern Ukraine. That territory would have included many of the strategic locations that I mentioned earlier. Since that unsuccessful attempt, the answer to why now is probably, would there be a better time? First, Russia has spent 8 years coping with sanctions, building a $640 billion war chest, much of which is not in American dollars, diversifying its trade, and substituting Western imports with local goods or from friendlier countries. Second, the West did not appear to have the appetite or the unity and thus the necessary resolve to intervene. Germany was moving forward with Nord Stream 2, a gas pipeline that would substantially weaken Ukraine's economy and Ukraine's position relative to Russia. In 2019, France and Germany pushed for the Council of Europe, Europe's premier institution for promoting the protection of human rights, to restore Russia's voting rights after they were suspended following the annexation in Crimea. It's often kind of portrayed as the first removal of sanctions against Russia. And the US is experiencing a stunning degree of partisanship, partisan infighting, where it seems that the only source of agreement that crosses the partisan divide is a desire to get out of and stay out of foreign conflicts. In addition, I would note that we are now seeing the degree to which Putin may have seen an opportunity in the contested elections in Belarus. The Kremlin's decision to back Lukashenko's regime in 2020 and the West's decision to isolate it eliminated Lukashenko's ability to continue to play the two sides off of one another. With Belarus squarely in Russia's orbit, it is likely that Lukashenko has struck at some sort of deal with Putin that allowed for military exercises in Belarus to become the staging ground for a Russian invasion of Ukraine from the north. Another reason for Russia to act sooner rather than later is the risk of allowing Ukraine more time to reform. The more time Ukraine had to build closer ties to the West, the harder it would be to gain control over Ukraine in the future. Finally, politics in Russia itself likely help to motivate and facilitate action. Putin's Russia has found that flawed elections will no longer continue to be a source of legitimacy, and Putin wants to stay in power. Clearing the political landscape of opposition candidates and independent media help the Kremlin present a narrative of Fortress Russia. And for Fortress Russia to survive, it will need an empire. The answers to where we are and what's next will partially depend on how the West and the world reacts. To the extent that we are witnessing a dissatisfied rising power challenge the post-Cold War order, one based on Washington's view of sovereignty, then we might conclude that the international system is a transitioning world order. From this perspective, the more the international community stands with Ukraine, the more likely it will be for the Washington system to survive. One factor that may help the international community's resolve is to remember that even if Russia draws the line in NATO countries, there are other vulnerable non-NATO countries where Russia has an interest, and these include Georgia and Moldova, both of which have Russian-backed separatist regions. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Next up, we have Aida Hozic. Aida, why don't you go ahead and take the mic?
Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you, Bryon, for this excellent introduction. Thanks, Amie and the staff of the CES for organizing this on a very short notice. And I also just wanted to say a word of or offer a word of support, I think, on behalf of all of us to our students who come from Ukraine or from Russia or from any other nearby region, for whom I know it's incredibly difficult now to watch this war unfold. And sometimes it's difficult even to listen to people like us who are kind of talking about in much more clinical terms than you probably would want. But rest assured that if you knock on any of our doors, we'll be very happy to see you, okay? I will look at this unfolding crisis in Ukraine from a different regional perspective. I will look at it from the Balkans, and I will try to argue that, unfortunately, perhaps one of the greatest tragedies of the moment that we find ourselves in right now is that it could have been foreseen. So to lay kind of the groundwork for that argument, I'll take you back 20 plus years in the past to the kind of end game of the Yugoslav wars, which took place in the 1990s, at a time when Russia was very weak. So while it was often consulted and a participant in what was happening in Yugoslavia and included by the Western negotiators, it really did not have much of a say. So to start with, let me take you back to June of 1999 and the end of the bombing campaign that NATO organized of Yugoslavia, of Serbia in particular, with an explicit aim to protect Kosovo Albanians from the Serbian violence, ethnic cleansing, and potentially genocide at that time. While Russia initially opposed that bombing to the point of blocking Security Council resolution that would allow for it to proceed along with China, the truce was actually eventually negotiated by the U.S. Deputy Secretary of State at the time, Strobe Talbot, in very kind of close coordination with Russian envoy Viktor Chernomyrdin and Finnish President Martti Ahtisaari, who represented the European Union. So they signed a truce on June 9th with an agreement that peacekeepers would come from NATO and include some peacekeepers from Russia to protect peace in Kosovo. 3 days later, however, on June 12th, a contingent of Russian troops and 200 soldiers showed up at the airport of Pristina, Kosovo capital, and occupied the airport. That was the first such confrontation between Russian forces and NATO forces since the end of the Cold War, and one of the very few in which they actually were in a standoff against each other directly. That incident, which was resolved after another set of negotiations, that lasted for about 2 or 3 days, and the tensions were reduced, we would learn later was organized by a man that no one in the Western policy-making world at the time paid any attention to. His name was Vladimir Putin, and at that time he was the Secretary of the Security Council of Russia. Just 2 months after that incident, he would become Prime Minister of Russia and then eventually president. Kosovo, in the decades since that incident, and the Yugoslav wars and Serbia would continue to play a very important role in Putin's foreign policy. They were constantly on the list of his kind of grievances against the West, but they also helped articulate his foreign policy views. In Putin's view, that secession of Kosovo from Yugoslavia, and its eventual independence in 2008 created a very dangerous precedent in international and regional politics. As Bryon has already alluded to, it really touched upon this understanding of sovereignty that Russia has, which is very different than the one in the West. And that precedent of secession and acknowledgement and recognition of Kosovo by many of the Western states now serves multiple purposes in Russia's foreign policy practices, but also in their justifications for their foreign policy choices. The end of the USSR and the collapse of Yugoslavia in the 1990s have led to the creation of dozens breakaway areas and quote unquote ethnic enclaves, as well as more than over 23 new states. So Russia has actually feared kind of a chain reaction from that Kosovo secession and independence and its recognition by other states, and kind of fear the further fragmentation of their own territory. You don't have to think anywhere further than Chechnya, which was leveled by Russian forces precisely because it kind of showed same aspirations towards independence. At the same time, however, Russia has very consciously manipulated a number of these semi-sovereign areas, which kind of popped up in the region. They are in Moldova, in Azerbaijan, in Georgia, in Ukraine, but also in Bosnia and Herzegovina, in the Balkans, another kind of part of the former Yugoslavia. Russia has used these regions to destabilize newly independent states and actually entire region, like the Caucasus or the Balkans. That logical manipulation has always relied on the same two premises. If this could happen in Kosovo, then it can happen elsewhere. Or unlike in Kosovo, which is, for instance, what they're saying about Crimea, then we can legitimize this annexation and or secession. So Kosovo has become really kind of crucial, both strategically and discursively, in the maintenance of the Russian ontological security, as well as in its kind of expansion of its sphere of influence in Europe. By tweaking tensions in the former Yugoslavia, Russia has for years exerted perpetual low-grade pressure on the EU and the United States, whose own interests and preoccupations had in the meantime moved elsewhere. Russian leadership learned a lot from Slobodan Milosevic and from Yugoslav wars, as well as from the Western response to those wars. At the same time, the US attention shifted to the kind of neocon synthesis of regime change in Afghanistan, Iraq, and elsewhere. So in sport terms, the United States and the EU kind of departed the region, leaving behind their B players in the Balkans, while Russia, in the meantime, brought to Yugoslavia its A game. So using the openings which were created by the global war on terror, global financial crisis, and the American pivot to Asia, Russia has maintained and amplified its hold onto the former Yugoslav republics, now states, politically, economically, and militarily since the early 2000s. After the regime change in Serbia, Russia intensified its support for the remnants of the Milosevic regime in Serbia proper. It has hosted the Milosevic family and a number of disgraced Serbian generals. It's been courting major celebrities and intellectual and media figures in Serbia. It has bankrolled war criminals who were on the run and members of paramilitary units, infiltrated Serbia's security apparatus, and most interestingly, its financial regulatory agencies, and strengthened its ties to the Serbian Orthodox Church. Russia has made major investments in Serbia's energy sector, real estate, retail, and tourism. Most interestingly, perhaps, Russian Gazprom became the major sponsor of Belgrade's most famous soccer team, called Red Star Crvena Zvezda, thus giving Russia control and access over the soccer fans, hooligans, and therefore the Belgrade underworld. Expressions of support for Russia have become very common in soccer games, as has been the use of these hooligans in threats to journalists, opposition politicians, and human rights activists. Russia's reach in the meantime, and this is very emblematic of how Russia has been operating in other parts of Europe as well, and that's why I'm kind of going through this. Russia's reach has extended to other former Yugoslav republics as well. It has exploited disappointments of Macedonia's right-wing nationalist party over its unfulfilled NATO promises and lured its leadership to its side until the protests changed the regime in 2016. It used its hold on Montenegro's real estate and tourism, where oligarchs purchased half of the properties, to exert its influence over politics in that tiny little corner of the former Yugoslavia and the Balkans. And then importantly, through the expansion of its financial and banking sector, as well as its energy sector, but via Hungary, Germany, and Austria, so not always directly, Russia also expanded into the EU member states. This is my dog Bagel. I apologize, he doesn't like probably what's going on. Russia expanded into the EU member states, Slovenia and Croatia. Yeah, and then most importantly, Russia has actually since 2003 kind of exerted almost full control over the Bosnian ethnic entity, Republika Srpska, which is controlled by the Serbs, using kind of that region again in this if Kosovo then as a constant chip in kind of again negotiations over the region and in the efforts to keep the Balkans in constant state of instability. So the result of all of these actions has actually been the creation of a politically divided region whose elites can now be easily blackmailed and who can always be counted on changing their political allegiances according to who pays them more, frankly, and how they see the political winds blowing. So where does that bring us now after this Russian invasion of Ukraine? Croatia and Slovenia, the EU member states, and Macedonia, which is a member of NATO, have actually kind of sided with the EU sanctions and with the West, despite very significant costs. The run on the Russian banks in Croatia has been instant. People have rushed to kind of get their deposits out of the banks. They're in near collapse. But the Croatian government is at the moment, and Slovenian are saying that they will protect people's deposits. On the other hand, Serbia, Bosnia and Herzegovina, because of this kind of Serbian ethnic enclave within Bosnia, and Montenegro are the only states in Europe at the moment, apart from Belarus, that have not imposed sanctions on Russia or closed their airspace to Russian airplanes. So as the economic blockade of Russia intensifies, they are basically the last kind of airwaves that Russia has in contact with Europe and with the outside world in that corner of Europe. There is also considerable concern in the region that especially if that war continues to go badly in Ukraine, Russia can easily turn to the Balkans to open up another front, to distract and divide the West, and to drain its resources. That fear is particularly palpable among Serbian leadership, which is now schizophrenically extolling its neutrality, supporting Ukrainian territorial integrity, and refusing to punish Russia in any way. President Vučić of Serbia has been saying, we are a small country, we can't really decide on the future of Ukraine, leave us out of this. But at the same time, Serbia is stockpiling arms, foods, and medicine as if it's expecting an invasion tomorrow morning. The key airports in Serbia are full of Russian warplanes. And Russia has also created a kind of center for humanitarian action in the south part of Serbia in the town of Niš, which everybody knows is kind of a very thinly veiled nerve center for military and intelligence operations for Russia in the Balkans. And so many are fearing a new war in Bosnia and Herzegovina, where Republika Srpska, again, this ethnic enclave that Russia controls, has remilitarized this past summer. But I'm also fearing that the action could return to Kosovo, where we started. Because Kosovo is a home to a very large US and NATO military base. Whether or not the conflict over Ukraine will escalate, and if it does, where would it go? That's kind of literally $1 million question at the moment. But the Balkans is worth watching very closely. President Putin and Foreign Minister Lavrov were just yesterday in conversations with the leadership of Republika Srpska, stoking more fears in the region. So I think that it's really not completely crazy to think that this might become another site of escalation. And I would end at that.
Thank you so much, Aida. Next, we're going to turn to Michael Bernhard. I will share the screen again for your presentation.
Thanks. So this presentation will be more political economy and strategy. Here you see a chart of the GDP of the 10 largest economies in Europe, with Russia bolded and italicized. You see the total of the 10, the total less Russia, and what percentage of the largest 10 European economies Russia constitutes, which is approximately 10%. So we will start there. The first thing we need to grasp here is that Russia is only a medium-sized economic power. By any measure, it is not a major economic power. It is dwarfed by the 4 largest economic powers on the globe: the United States, China, the EU, and Japan. From this, we have to question Russia's ability to fight a protracted war. War is very expensive to wage, and Russia has a moderately sized economy. Second, if we think about the ways in which this war would develop, the best it could have gone for Putin would be a quick overrun of the Ukraine and a removal of the government. That didn't happen. That would be similar to, let's say, the US case in Iraq, but Russia did not seem to have that capacity. And it's another question altogether to put an effective pro-occupier government in place for a duration. The problem there, of course, would be protracted low-level warfare. And we know that more powerful states have had a problem doing this in the recent past. Witness the experience of the United States in Iraq or Afghanistan. Further, if we look at this data, we see that Russia is actually overmatched in comparison to Europe. Furthermore, in comparison to furthermore, in its relationship to the EU, it is dependent on the EU, both for capital and its major export, which are petroleum products. So the Russian economy exports petroleum largely in exchange for manufacture. Thus, in the short to medium term, Russian welfare is dependent on Europe, and thus European sanctions, as we've seen, can bite very hard. This is a comparison of the armed forces of those 10 large states, including Russia. Switzerland is a neutral, so I have it as a separate category, and then everything else here is European NATO in the top, and I have the US as the bottom as a comparison, looking sort of at major indicators of military power. So as you can see, Europe, even if we take Turkey out, thinking that the Turks might not want to fight with the West, they may well, because I think they're unhappy and they're not very happy with Russia either for a host of other reasons. But you see 8 NATO economies or 7 NATO economies have more troops, active personnel than Russia. They do have less tanks, but they have more warships, more combat aircraft, a military budget at least 1.5 times more, and their overall population is more than double Russia's. If you bring in the fact that they're allied with the United States, which has a much larger army than Russia and actually surpasses it in every category here except for tanks, though American tanks are built on a different philosophy than Russian tanks, which are small and numerous. American tanks are more heavily armored and weigh almost twice as much. The warship stuff is not compatible because the US does not have a host of small craft. And if you look at the total for US in terms of warships, it includes 10 or 11 aircraft carriers, of which Russia has only 1 or 2. So there's no comparison in military strength here. And what's peculiar too is that European NATO on itself has superior military resources to Russia, yet at the same time, it treats Russia as though it is 10 feet tall, which is in some way vexing. So what can we say about this? The Russian armed forces are large. Putin has modernized them, but in what we've seen in the last few days, we need to question perhaps how effectively he has modernized him. We don't know. We don't seem to see that training is particularly sharp. There does not seem to be the kind of combined arms tactics that seem to be the state of the art in land warfare these days and allow armies to move quickly to destroy their enemies and take control of territory. It was fully expected that Russia would establish air superiority in the first hours of the war, and air superiority does not seem to have been established yet. Obviously, air superiority makes it much easier to maneuver, control ground, and to destroy the enemy. Furthermore, Russia seems to have major logistical problems, that is, keeping enough ammunition and fuel with its forces. And this is not projection halfway around the world, but in a neighboring country, which until a few decades ago shared the same infrastructure. So this is really poor performance. So in general, I would say that this seems like a major strategic miscalculation by the Russians. And the reason why Russia's had a free hand so far is actually its nuclear strength, which makes the West actually afraid of fighting a land war with Russia for the fact that it could escalate. There's also the question of how much the West would be willing to defend the territorial integrity of something like Ukraine, something that I'm sure the Russians took into or Putin took into his calculations. Certainly the response after 2014, where there was a lackluster economic sanctions response, probably played into Putin's calculations as well. However, perhaps he drew the wrong lesson. He thought perhaps the West would repeat what it did rather than learn from its experience. He also seems to have miscalculated how Germany would respond. In the past, German reticence to be involved in armed conflict in Europe or to take any kind of lead in that has been nil. And with the departure of Merkel and her replacement, the Germans have taken a rather different stance. So clearly, I think this is a case of Russian overstretch. It was a highly risky maneuver, and the first steps did not go well. They miscalculated on Ukrainian resistance. They miscalculated on Western solidarity in putting up even more stringent economic sanctions than they did in 2014 or after the Skripal poisonings or other acts that the West saw as cases of Russian hostility. Protracted struggle, which now seems what will happen, will have major negative ramifications both for Russia and Ukraine. If that struggle is even more protracted, Putin has effectively rolled the dice with his hold on power in Russia because the sanctions do seem to be biting very hard. The ruble is now worth approximately a penny. There will be ramifications for the rest of the world economically, specifically rising energy and food prices. The Brent crude price this morning was $100 or more. And both Southern Russia and Ukraine are major exporters of wheat to the south. This means that there actually could be food shortages in some of the countries of the Middle East and North Africa to which Russia and Ukraine export grain. That's not good globally, and it will also help to spark inflation. So to conclude, Russia acted like it was 10 feet tall. It is a formidable military power that has a nuclear capability. It probably doesn't have the economic potential to fight a protracted war, and it miscalculated on what the response of their immediate opponents in this, both the Ukrainians and the West, would be in response to their actions, and they're now in a very precarious position. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think as a nice follow along from that, Zachary Selden.
Yeah, no, thank you. And I, I was thinking about echoing some of Michael's comments, especially about the Russian military, but I think he's covered that very well. And I very much concur in his assessment that this has put more Russian weakness on display than rather strength at this point in time. So I think what I'm going to do is focus in on the NATO component of this and the NATO-Ukrainian relationship to some degree, and then think about where this is going in a broader context for Russia and Europe. So, you know, kind of have to understand how we got here. And NATO has had a very long and complex relationship with Ukraine over the past 25 years, I mean, also with Russia for that matter. But it's very important to stress that all this is driven by Ukraine's desires as a sovereign state, right? And I bring that up because one point that I have heard from some quarters is that somehow what's happening now is the fault of NATO's enlargement to the east, which threatens Russia. I want to make it very clear, you know, as someone who worked in that environment for quite a while, NATO doesn't go around asking countries to join. NATO is not hanging around the proverbial schoolyard, you know, saying, hey, kids, want to join an alliance? All the cool kids are, right? That's not how this works. It responds to requests from sovereign countries to engage in relationships up to and including membership, right? And that can vary quite a lot, but it is a process fundamentally driven by what the sovereign states of Europe want, nothing else. And no one has a veto over that. Not the United States, not Russia. Second, it's logically incoherent to say that the prospect of NATO membership drove Russia to invade now. And let me explain why. Membership is not under consideration and cannot be as long as Russia, which has created territorial conflicts in Ukraine and Luhansk to Donbass and Crimea, as long as those conflicts are there, NATO is not going to take in a country with such conflicts on its territory. It will not do that. That is an absolute bright line. So if Russia's goal is the prevention of another NATO state on its borders in Ukraine, it had already achieved that with the status quo prior to the invasion. Right? So that cannot be the rationale or the reason. Now, this relationship between Ukraine and NATO has gone through, you know, ups and downs over the years. It made a big leap forward after 2014 and after the 2014 invasion. So what Ukraine wanted at that point was a membership action plan. And that is essentially the thing that pulls you into the membership channel. It's quite open-ended and it could take years and years, but once you're into that, the assumption on both sides is that you will become a member, right? They don't have that. And that's obviously not forthcoming as long as there is this territorial conflict. So what NATO did instead, and this is really beginning in 2016, is it created what was called a comprehensive action plan in cooperation with Ukraine. And this really provides some quite serious aid towards Ukraine in some rather specific and very important areas, which I think you're seeing play out today in this kinetic operation with Russia. So where was the money and the training and the expertise put into? Command, control, communications, computers, C4. It went into logistics and logistics planning and standardization and coordination between services. It went into cybersecurity. All this stuff, you know, is relatively mundane, but as you know, the joke goes, amateurs talk about strategy, but professionals talk about logistics, right? This is the stuff that helps you actually win wars, right? And I think as Michael was just saying, the tip of the Russian military spear is quite good, and they put a lot of money and effort into that. What they have not done is put the same kind of effort into the logistical chain that would supply and support that. And that is why you're seeing Russian units stranded without ammunition or without provisions and food, or lost with poor tactical coordination, belying poor training. So I think a lot of what you're seeing today, in some ways, from the Ukrainian military doing better than Russia expected, or frankly, most of us, is in part, or in large part, owed to years of training and assistance from NATO and from its members in particular areas that leverage existing Ukrainian capabilities in a way that, frankly, Russia has neglected. And what this is exposing is Russia's fundamental military weaknesses rather than showcasing its strengths. So that's kind of where we are in terms of where NATO is going with Ukraine now. It's always important to note that NATO itself as an organization doesn't have a lot of stuff, right? The member states have stuff. NATO can act as a coordinating body, and it certainly is in this case in trying to coordinate assistance and aid and avoid duplication in terms of getting stuff to Ukraine in a timely fashion. It has some transport capacity to assist in that. But everything is really a national government resource, not necessarily a NATO resource beyond things of intelligence coordination and stuff along those lines. So I think where we're standing now is that essentially time is on Ukraine's side, right? Every day this drags on is essentially a political loss for Russia. And Ukraine doesn't have to win. It just has to not lose, right? And I think they're doing a good job at not losing right now. In terms of where this goes in the long term, and once again, I think I'm echoing Michael to some degree, but let me pick up on a few points and also sort of reference back to some of Bryon's points about major Russian foreign policy objectives. I think win or lose in Ukraine as a military operation, Russia will lose on its broader foreign policy goals. What does Russia want? It wants a divided transatlantic alliance. It wants a divided EU, right? Russia's actions are driving everyone together. I don't think I've seen this level of unity on any single issue previously. And it's not just about this issue, right? You see the galvanizing effect, for example, on Germany. I can't tell you for how many years the United States and other allies have been pressuring Germany to do more about building up their military capacity. And this seems to have just turned on a dime, right? That's a long-term consequence. Russia wants to prevent NATO from enlarging further. And I think it's quite likely that Sweden and Finland will join NATO in the not too distant future. Russia wants to prevent significant NATO troops near its borders, and certainly in the parts of the former Soviet Union, the Baltic states, or Poland. And frankly, for years, NATO has avoided doing that explicitly out of sensitivity to Russian interests, right? That has always been the logic and the defining reasons for those decisions, right? That's over now. Russia wants Europe dependent on Russian energy. It's now a distinct possibility that liquefied natural gas from the United States and other suppliers can supplant much of that. And I think, as Michael pointed out, Russia is more dependent on revenue from gas exports to Europe than Europe is dependent on Russian supply. Europe can change its supply, okay? Russia is going to have a somewhat more difficult time shifting its supply to other customers because that gas supply is coming through fixed pipelines. Yes, it could conceivably export more to China, but doing that requires building a much more extensive pipeline, which is costly, it takes time. So it's not so easy for them to do that. So I think overall, right, as we look at this, that this may be a devastating event in Ukraine, and it is entirely possible that Russia, simply through force of weight more than anything else, will eventually create a military victory there of some kind. But long term, this is highly damaging to Russian interests, highly galvanizing for NATO as an institution, as well as, and I would turn it over here to Dr. Kreppel, the European Union. So I think I'll just stop there and yield my time.
Thank you. And I will take over the chair's privilege and just give a few comments about the EU I note that we already have a question to a certain degree about the EU. I just want to point out a few things in terms of what does the war in Ukraine mean to the EU? And to give context, it means two things most importantly. It means the return of war to the continent, and it means a very real return to a divided Europe. And the impact of those, I think, cannot be overestimated. As much as there's been a lot of discussion about the ideological power of Putin's ideal of Russia and where Russian territory is and his idea of what Russia should be, Europe also has very strong feelings about what Europe should be and what the European continent should look like in, after World War II. And while they haven't always been able to live up to those goals, and I'm thinking of the former Yugoslavia, each of those lessons has really clarified the goal and the view. And I think one of the reasons, or the only reasons, honestly, that we are seeing such a unified front and that we are seeing a direct impact on several laggards in the EU family in terms of both military development and sanctions on Russia is because of those two things: war on the continent and a divided Europe. So as a result, European member states, EU member states, have finally been forced to pick a side. And here I'm thinking politically, most clearly of Hungary and Poland. At the very beginning of the invasion, and even in the period leading up to it, I looked very carefully at press coming out of Poland and Hungary. And almost immediately, Poland chose its side, in line with a long-standing transatlantic Atlanticist focus in terms of foreign policy, but which had been undergoing some reduction in light of the illiberal bent of the current Polish regime. But they very quickly jumped on board to cast their voice with the rest of the EU. Hungary's been a little bit more challenging and more difficult. Orban has very close ties to Putin, and Orban has walked a razor-thin edge between the two sides of Russia and Europe. And I think from what I've seen just in the last day, understanding that I don't read Hungarian, Orban is realizing that he will have to pick a side, and facing domestic elections and facing the economic realities and facing the increasing clarity about the role that Putin is willing to play and the game that what Putin is willing to play with his allies. Hungary is turning more towards the EU and reconfirming that commitment, which may have long-term implications for these wayward European states in terms of their not so gradual slide to illiberal governance. There are, as Zach mentioned, additional impacts in terms of economic alliances. Germany and Italy were laggards in terms of wanting to block Russian banks from SWIFT, in terms of wanting to implement this most stringent sanctions, and certainly in terms of, for Germany, cutting off Nord Stream and other economic ties, because their connection economically to Russia is so strong. And because Draghi has spent the last year trying to rebuild Italy's economy, there was a reluctance to take the hard hit that these economic sanctions will impose on their domestic economies. And yet they've made that choice now. And they've made that choice now because of the return of war to the continent and because of the clarity of a divided Europe. So Putin has made these choices, if not easy, at least clear. And they will have long-term implications. Zach mentioned Germany's decisions to try to reinvest in defense. Scholz is talking about embedding in the basic law a requirement for a 2% commitment to defense. And that's something NATO has been trying to get out of all of its EU partners for a very long time with very limited success. And other EU member states are also looking back at a long history of cuts to defense, particularly since the fall of the Berlin Wall, and reassessing whether that peace dividend can really be relied upon in current circumstances. So going forward, what the war in Ukraine means for the EU is an unprecedented unity of action. I said that when Brexit happened, and I was impressed by that unity of action. Anyone who studies the EU was, but the current situation actually makes the unity surrounding Brexit pale in comparison. I think we can expect to see increased defense spending across the EU. I think we can expect to see increased EU security investment and a willingness for the EU to act in security realms as the EU, as we've seen with the decision announced a couple of days ago for the EU itself to procure weapons for Ukraine, which is unparalleled. And I think, as in the past with the EU, growth and integration occurs in the midst of crisis. And I think Putin has given them a crisis, and there's very rarely backtracking. So I think what we can expect to see is an EU that is more engaged in security matters and in military matters and on the world stage, and particularly in its own backyard. So with that, those are the end of my comments. We have a long list of questions. So I will try to go from those who began their questions. I'll begin with Courtney Pompey, a former Gator. Courtney asks, the events in Ukraine this week are galvanizing civil society and democracy activists. What does Putin's moves on Ukraine signal to other autocratic regimes? And will this lead to unprovoked attack? Will this unprovoked attack on Ukraine galvanize or embolden other autocrats, particularly as they engage with their civil society? I'm not sure who feels most able to address that question. Anybody want to volunteer for that?
I mean, I guess my sense of it is that Russia's in a unique position from this perspective. And you got a little bit of a sense of it in terms of the fact that it has nuclear weapons. It has a very specific interest in terms of its Russian speakers who are abroad. I don't know that, and to the extent that, when we think about this idea of kind of great power status, what's always irked me a little bit about that is most people around the world would think that Russia has great power status, right? It's an idea, it's a conception, it's a kind of a construction. But it's not an upper volta with rockets, as sometimes it was kind of categorized in the 1990s, since that it was a developing state, just happened to have nuclear weapons. I think as a major gas supplier, as a major trade partner with Europe, we still see Russia as separate, kind of distinct from other kind of autocratic regimes. That kind of raises questions about whether, if Russia gets away with certain behaviors, others will behave in the similar kind of way. I mean, I think the danger is more of opening up the Pandora's box of making claims on other territory where borders are suddenly can be called into question. I mean, I think that's a bigger issue in terms of not necessarily relationship with civil society, but kind of cross-border conflicts.
Okay. Given that we have so many questions, I think I'll try to limit it to one answer per question. We have a couple of questions that are a little bit related. Esther Romain notes that Zelensky has asked Ukraine to be fast-tracked for EU membership. How will this play out? And John Riskind asks about the Ukrainian inclusion of membership in NATO in their constitution, and wondering whether that might be removed as one way to accommodate Russia, and would that potentially lead to an end to the conflict? I can very quickly answer the question on the EU. It can't happen that way. There is no fast track to EU membership. EU membership is a decade-long adventure, even in the best of situations. And the Ukraine already was engaged with the EU in an association agreement. That's what precipitated Crimea, or at least was ostensibly what precipitated Crimea. The EU really wants to help, but there is no mechanism for fast tracking. And I don't know who wants to answer the question about Ukrainian membership in NATO in their constitution, and whether that might resolve the problem if they removed that from the constitution. Zach, why don't you go ahead?
I could probably take that on. Yeah, that's true. That came in, I think, in 2017. The Ukrainians put that into their constitution as an aspiration. That could conceivably be part of some negotiated settlement that puts an end to this, because things can be taken out of constitutions, they could be put back in, and honestly, whether or not it is in the Constitution doesn't necessarily dictate what happens, right? If what Russia wants is some kind of permanent guarantee and veto over Ukraine's foreign policy into the future ad infinitum, I don't see that as being a point that a Ukrainian government, certainly not the Zelensky government, could negotiate on. So yes, there may be some flexibility there to provide a face-saving measure for Russia. It's a short answer.
I think what we keep hitting up against is Bryon's clear demarcation between different definitions of sovereignty, and the way that that difference between the West and between Russia really prohibits, to a certain degree, this kind of compromise, right? All right, another guest asks for a more historical context. How does, this is Samantha Gildia, how does Russia's attack on Ukraine compare to the Soviet attack on Afghanistan? And how do you foresee the conflict resolving? If anyone can answer that last question, I think there are bigger stages for you, but is there a comparison to Afghanistan?
Yeah, I mean, the Soviet intervention into Afghanistan was done with a very different reason. It was done to prop up and put back into power a communist regime that was friendly to the Soviet Union in Afghanistan. That was, distinctly unpopular in much of the country. So that's kind of the inverse of what's happening now, where you're trying to take out a broadly popular, democratically elected regime and replace it with a puppet that will serve your interests. So I see them as kind of examples of opposite things in some ways.
I just would add the problem, with the Soviet Union found itself in Afghanistan is exactly what it's finding itself in a way. And in Ukraine, you would expect it to be even a stronger guerrilla insurgency and to be even more difficult to succeed in Ukraine, given the anti-Russian sentiment, the degree of national and patriotism that we see there. It's just going to be even a more difficult challenge for Russia to come out on the winning side here. They can come out on the winning side to the degree that they've destabilized Ukraine. But in terms of the lives lost and the having some degree of control over Ukraine, that's another kind of question.
So related to that, Anne-Marie Rizzo asks, she mentions that Fiona Hill observed that Putin thinks he wins in Ukraine, not only if he can take over Ukraine as it is, i.e. replacing the government, but could also win through a fallback position, simply breaking up the country. And that breakup might be one objective of Putin's, and to reclaim at least part of the former Soviet territory. So would this also be a form of Putin's winning? Do you think that it's likely? And how long do you think Putin's regime could last by pursuing that second option? Is that a viable option for them?
I guess I don't think that the fate of Putin's regime hinges on whether or not it succeeds or not in Ukraine. I think now it will hinge on its relationship with the West and the pain of these sanctions. And it also, the question, going back to the question of civil society, civil society has been quelled, the landscape has been cleared to a certain degree. But even with these protests, ultimately, I think when we think about what brings down authoritarian regimes, it's elite defection. And so there has to be kind of a bigger question of what's the inner circle thinking, what are the pains and consequences that they're feeling. The win that Fiona Hill's talking about with destabilizing Ukraine is a win prior to, that's kind of how Putin would have thought about it before we're seeing, and I'm on the same page of kind of underestimating European resolve, Western unity, the degree of opposition to this war. It was a different landscape even 5 days ago in terms of what we were expecting to unfold globally. And I do think that there's been a kind of a global response to this, and just going back to my talk, to the sense that the Washington system, while flawed, while privileging the United States, is a better system than this idea of going back to a kind of Westphalian understanding of sovereignty for most countries, because most countries are small powers.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. We have a couple of questions on the nuclear reality, Russia as a nuclear power. A couple of people asking whether or not it's being treated as 10 feet tall because of this arsenal, which was not included in Michael's tables, and whether or not it might be, whether he's a rational actor and whether or not it might be a miscalculation on the West's part to underestimate the idea that all of this is a pretext for nuclear escalation? Is he rational in that context? That's Rich Conley and also Noah Smith.
So it was in my presentation, which is why he's treated as 10 feet tall. That is, conventionally, we can't engage with him without the threat of an escalation that includes nuclear weapons. So it means the West, for instance, has to be much more reticent with Vladimir Putin than it did have to be with Saddam Hussein or with Afghanistan or with other places like that, because the escalation is even if it's a small possibility, the potential negatives are huge globally. As for whether Putin's a rational actor, unless we know his preferences, we can't decide whether he's rational or not. So I don't think that's a particularly useful question to say whether he's rational. He's pursuing a set of aims, but since we don't know what his priorities are and what he's going for, we don't know what he's doing is rational or not. I mean, if you think you know what his motivations are, then you can determine if he's rational.
I mean, to be fair, a little bit on that question was that there was, I was listening to Nina Khrushcheva last night talking about how Putin's gone crazy or something, like that kind of idea that Putin's lost his mind. And I mean, I think a better sense of it is, let's think about what his preferences might be, and this would relate to a little bit of a shrinking inner circle, surrounding himself more with the Siloviki, who are more militarily minded, and kind of, again, misreading Ukraine, not understanding or choosing to cynically portray it. And so, I mean, I do think that the larger frameworks in which we see Russian foreign policy help us see why he would have taken the step, even if it's clearly coming out as a miscalculation. But we're all using this term that he overestimated this or underestimated that. From that perspective, we're assuming a certain degree of rational behavior on that part.
Thank you. I realized that I also forgot to mention, and some attendees have left, there is an additional event tonight where both Bryon Moraski and Zach Selden will be giving additional discussion. I have posted the link to everyone. So please, if you just can't get enough today, or if we don't get to your question, because there's quite a few of them, please feel free to also come tonight. There are a fair number of questions. Honestly, I can't get to all of them, but there's a fair number of questions asking about the potential for military engagement, that is boots on the ground, either from European countries or from American forces. To what extent do we see that becoming a reality? And if so, under what conditions? Where would we see that actually happening, if we think it could happen at all?
My general sense is that under current conditions, there's no NATO member that is willing to become involved with significant military forces in Ukraine in a direct conflict with Russia. I mean, that is just off the table. So the question is, what are the things that you can do up until that support Ukrainian forces? And that's been primarily what's been funneled in. And I think that could be highly effective, being that we've seen the Ukrainian military at this point is not the Ukrainian military of 2014. It does have considerable capabilities. And, so to the extent that it can be aided from the outside, that may be enough. And it's certainly not going to reach a point that would require, as you said, boots on the ground from, the United States or its allies. The only possibility one can imagine is if this progressed further into somehow, Bulgaria or Romania. That just seems completely out of the prospects. I don't see this happening.
Yeah, I wanted to kind of go back to some of the questions from before and underscore what I think what Bryon and Zach had said before, and Amie, you as well, is that the calculus has really changed just over these last 5 days of what is feasible and what's not feasible. Even a week ago, we could have thought it would not have been a happy solution, but those who were in favor of some kind of diplomatic solution might have thought, okay, let's give them, let's have a Yalta II, and perhaps that will appease Putin, and that way there will be no violence and we can protect Ukraine, et cetera, et cetera. The invasion has completely taken that option off the table now. And that makes it very difficult to think about what other solution but a military solution is possible. And so that is where, on the one hand, what Zach was saying, Ukrainians have turned out to be really, I mean, it's obvious that they were excellent learners over the past 7-8 years, that they have access to all the best intelligence. They're being fed intelligence that goes all the way down to the street level. Even the Turks have given them drones, which they know how to use, which kind of makes a mockery almost of the tank warfare that we could have imagined before. So there are lots of kind of things here that are making this operationally into a very different war than, once again, we feared it might be. On the other hand, we can't underestimate, I think, and this is where learning from Milosevic comes from, and also thinking about Grozny as a precedent, we can't underestimate the willingness of the Russian military to just simply level the place, okay? To just not to annihilate it. And they do have some capacity for that. The air defenses are holding very well in Ukraine thus far, but it's not to be completely excluded as a possibility. So in some way, the only solution that we can see here is military solution, or is the collapse of the Putin regime. Which one is going to happen first is, again, $1 million question. Who's going to crack first is what we don't know.
There's a fair number of questions about the ability of Ukraine to defend itself and Ukraine's resources. That is, Michael talked a lot about Europe's, not Ukraine, and Russia's. But to what extent does the Ukrainian government have what they need? To what extent are resources being provided as is necessary? How long can they effectively defend themselves? Do they have some of the same tools that were used in Afghanistan to defend themselves? Where are we with that?
I think most of all, they continue to need to get a healthy supply of shoulder-fired anti-tank and anti-aircraft weapons. That's the best defense they have right now. Their equipment is not as good as the Russian. They don't have as many men. They at least do have a large number of people with combat experience, given the fighting in the East. And they're now trying to organize home defense forces, which could become a basis for protracted urban warfare, making it very hard for the Russians to occupy the cities. In terms of what Aida said, it just throws a chill down my spine, turning Kiev into Grozny. My hope on that is that it would have such powerful negative costs for Russia of being a kind of permanent pariah state that that's not on the table. But, they could get away with it in Grozny. Could they get away with it in Kiev? And I just hope that's not on the table, because it's as horrible as Grozny was, Kiev is much bigger.
There are a number of questions about public opinion, whether that's in Europe, Ukraine, or Russia. Some ask about the efficacy of the denazification rhetoric, particularly in Russia or in allied states with Russia, that is in the West, that is largely discounted, but does that have hold? And how does that affect protest movement? So we've seen some evidence of anti-war protests in Russia. We've obviously seen very large anti-war protests in support of Ukraine across Europe and elsewhere. How do these things interact, and to what extent are they going to have any impact eventually on the outcome of what we're seeing?
I was a little frustrated when I saw some polls after or some media reporting on the popular support for Putin's recognition of the Luhansk People's Republic and Donetsk People's Republic, and the press, even Radio Free Europe, picked up the Vizion poll, which was 74% of Russians supported that decision, when there was the Levada Center poll, which told it at 45% actually supported that amount, or those decisions. So clearly the state-owned Vizion poll is biased. The degree to which we might have 45% supporting, the question always becomes, well, who's the 45, and what influence does maybe the majority in this actually feel like they had? I received a message from a friend of mine in Irkutsk yesterday. He teaches at a university, and his take on it is that the propaganda is in full swing. He's worried his connection's not there. I haven't heard from him. We switched over to Telegram. I haven't heard from him since then. But he is very concerned about the intelligentsia facing intimidation. He said it had felt like he could speak freely at Russian universities to a certain degree, and that's gone. I mean, his words, everything's destroyed. So there is a significant clampdown on the population, and I think actually I know another brother of a Russian political scientist who was arrested at a protest, and then you factor into that the economic hardship that Russians are now going to be facing. I mean, to the degree to which they now will be focusing on trying to survive and make ends meet during this time period, and whether or not how much that drives in the street or how much that leads them to be focusing on the day-to-day is a very important consideration as well. I think that those who buy into the Putin propaganda see the sanctions as reinforcing the view of the Kremlin, which is this is the West encircling Russia, attacking Russia when Russia is doing the kinds of things, or at least framing as though Russia and the Kremlin are doing the kinds of things that the West and the United States does, which is trying to protect certain minority interests or look out for human rights. We know that on the West that that's not true, but those who have kind of only getting the state-run media's perspective on this see this as hypocrisy coming out of the West. So we really don't know, unfortunately, in authoritarian regimes, we can't know people's true preferences. And at the same time, the regime can't know its true preferences. All it can try to do is control it.
I also wanted to warn about something else, and to thank Esther Remain for mentioning Aleppo here and not just Grozny, which yes was also leveled by the Russian airplanes, and that reminds me. I mean, we also have to be careful and not overestimate the attention span of the West. And the support, which is now enormous for Ukraine, if this war is protracted, we don't have a very good record of keeping our eyes in places where wars go on for a very long time. That support begins to dwindle, and so there's there are both sides to this being a protracted war. On the one hand, it weakens Russia. But the question is also whether that then creates different kinds of openings in the West, again, for divisions and for Russia to kind of reignite some of its supporters, whether it's through blackmail or, corruption or, threats. It doesn't really matter. But I'm very worried about the instances of enormous support which deflate very quickly in the West.
Mm-hmm. All right, so many questions, and they're all very, very good. There have been a fair number of questions about the broader impacts of the conflict, the role that you guys might expect China to play, or how this might affect foreign relations and foreign policy outside of the immediate area, particularly in terms of Asia and with China, both in terms of relationships between the EU and China or Asia, and Russia and Asia and the US. So anyone?
I'm scheduled to actually talk on this in about half an hour with a different group, so I'll pick up some of this. I mean, Russia and China have forged, more strategic cooperation in recent months than previously. I am somewhat skeptical of the depths of that, given the wariness that both sides have about each other. But I do think that the PRC has been watching these events very closely, and the notable absence of PRC support for Russia's actions, I think, should be taken as a sign here that they don't see this going very well. For the PRC, there are some distinct parallels to the situation in Taiwan. They're very different situations, but a similar kind of deep set historical narrative that plays very well inside the country, a sense about sort of eliminating past offenses to the state and to the national glory of the state that surround these two places, whether it's Ukraine or Taiwan. So there are some similarities there, but I think that in particular, the PRC is watching this and learning certain lessons but they may be driving them towards much more caution in these kinds of situations rather than action.
Yeah, I mean, I just would echo that a little bit from the perspective that I think that initial Chinese-Russia alliance, if we want to even use that word, that we saw kind of raised prior to the Olympics was more of, well, we'll see how you do.
Yeah.
Right. I think China was interested in seeing how Russia did, how the West responded. And I think, we might say, well, this is a lot of support for Ukraine, but I think it's also, if this precedent stands, is Russia the least of our worries?
All right. We have a couple of questions on the EU, briefly, just UK-EU relations during this, now that the UK is out. The UK has been completely parallel with the EU on decisions. There's been, despite current issues and still negotiating Brexit on this topic, there has been complete unity. But more critically, questions about the refugee crisis and the ways in which Europe is managing that. Obviously, previous refugee crises were quite controversial within Europe and quite divisive. They had significant domestic implications. And there is a very large refugee crisis right now coming in from Ukraine, with estimates at more than 500,000 people having already crossed into the Poland and the other countries of Eastern Central Europe. And it's notable that so far they've been welcomed with open arms everywhere, including Hungary, where there is perhaps the least welcoming environment for refugees. I don't know, and I don't think anyone knows what happens when this drags on past the immediate, in line with what Aida said. The large scale embracing and support, over days, weeks, and months can certainly wane. And there is obviously a large economic cost to welcoming refugees. There is a difficulty in management of it. But I think, as is noted in many places, there is much more of a feeling of we and us with Ukrainians than there was with the refugees coming from the Middle East. And that makes that acceptance easier, whether or not we like that explanation. There are also a number of greetings, another former student. Hi, John. There's a bunch of questions about outcomes. How do we expect this to end? Our time is getting short. There's only about 8 minutes left. And I did want to make sure that we got to this one. What are possible outcomes? What is the best case scenario? What is the worst case scenario? And I'd ask all of you to think about this and give an answer. How do we see this going forward? What do we expect to see in the next few weeks or months, and why?
Honestly, I kind of want to circle back to Aida's point on this, which is a lot will depend on our attention span.
Okay.
I think that Putin has calculated on the fact that the West will move on to other things, that there is a certain degree, especially in the United States, of war fatigue, and that we have our hands full. We have our hands full with inflation that was on the rise before this began. We have our hands full with a pandemic that has its own unpredictable turns of events. And I think that Putin felt like he already outlasted, for example, part of Europe in with the Crimea, as soon as again this suspension of voting rights was lasted for 5 years, and then they pull it off partially because Russian financing for the Council of Europe created with a substantial amount of the Council of Europe's budget, and then also thinking that is it better to have Russia in Europe or out of Europe? If you kick Russia out of the Council of Europe, then individual Russians can't go to the European Court of Human Rights to get some kind of hearing against the state. So there are these kind of complications that will matter over not the next few days, but over the next few weeks and months. And the question of kind of resolving unity that I was negative about pessimistic about. I'm currently a little more optimistic, but I still have some pessimism. My time when I was in Ukraine and during the Revolution of Dignity was over the course of a couple of weeks. I decided that if it can get worse, it will. That Putin, when in a corner, continues to lash out, and I think that we just continue to see a kind of escalation of military activity from Crimea into Syria. And I'm not optimistic, I guess. So.
Okay, Aida.
Yeah, I want to say something which can be easily overlooked, and perhaps it's an important factor in how this is going to evolve, at least from the side of the West. Those of you who know me, you probably know that I'm like the least likely person to praise anyone ever in Washington, D.C. But I think in this particular instance, there are three people who really should be praised, and that is Secretary Blinken, CIA Director William Burns, and Lloyd Austin, who runs Department of Defense, because this kind of response and this kind of level of unity among the Europeans could not have been achieved by Putin's invasion only. It was prepared slowly and painstakingly, definitely over the last couple of months, but perhaps even longer. And so there are people in DC who knew how to prepare for this scenario. And frankly, that's what gives me a little bit of confidence in not only them, but obviously their partners in Europe, so that what is a tremendously dramatic crisis could actually be turned into this unity in a very short period of time. Whether they will be able to keep that going is really kind of crucial. Once again, and that's paired with this attention span of the West and the elections which are coming up, and how they think some of them how they think it's going to play into their advantage or not. But I think that's crucial, and we have to keep that in mind. The outcome, once again, the danger here is that there will be people who will be, and I don't think that the danger is that the Putin regime falls, but it would be the triumphalism over it, because that has gotten us in trouble before. I do think that there's a number of people, again, both in DC and in Europe, who do not think that it's completely silly that in that case Russia becomes a part of a reconfigured European security, and that really needs to be put back on the table. But I also think that nobody thinks that can be done with Putin in power. I don't think that there's anyone anymore who's ready to negotiate with him, and again, approve something like a Yalta to keep peace.
Michael?
Yes, I guess I like that point, the last point, from the perspective that we do have a tendency in the West to think that if we see regime changes, some kind of regime changes in the right direction. It could, one of the ways that Putin has held on to power is to say, you want a Putin without Russia, Россия без Putina. Well, you imagine what that would look like. Now, that's a scare tactic, but at the same time, it is notable that some of those foreign policy foundations that I laid out earlier, those are kind of establishment positions. Does that mean that they justify going into Ukraine and that other elites believe in it and accept it? But I would say not necessarily, right? This is now shown as a mistake. But in terms of someone else coming to power and continuing to see the West as an adversary, continuing to see NATO as an expansion, as a threat, those kinds of mentalities and ideas will likely persist.
Michael, did you want to chime in?
Yeah, I think a lot actually in terms of the resolution hinges on Russian domestic politics. Mm-hmm. And there are two important actors here, which are the elites around Putin, and going back to our first question, civil society actors. There are two ways that regime split that could lead to unseating of Putin could occur. The first would be that poor performance leads people to conspire against him, remove him, and replace him with an insider. The alternative would be that a split in the elite could be provoked from protest action from below. And my take would be that to the extent that if there's a process of Putin replacement and or regime change in Russia, the extent to which Russian society is involved and indigenous Democrats, naysayers to a bellicose foreign policy are involved in provoking that and can maintain themselves mobilized as the regime transition goes on, will make it much easier to get the kind of Russia integrated into a new European security format that is seen as the most, or the least pessimistic outcome posited here by my colleagues. So I would think that the extent to which Russian civil society could activate in the midst of regime crisis would help to move to a more peaceful and long-term stable outcome.
Zach?
Which is just something.
Oh, wait, Bryon?
So it's just something the regime has tried to prepare for and tried to prevent. Whether they successfully have done that, we don't know.
Okay, Zach?
I mean, very briefly, I realize we're out of time, but I would just focus back in on the energy security issue. This is a huge part of Russia's export earnings. This is a huge part of Russian elite earnings, right? And to me, if you start to see this rather permanent and long-term shift away from Russian supply into Europe, substituted by other players, including the United States, which has ramped up massively, that could be the real, I think, a real game changer. So I would be looking at signs of that starting to actually coalesce and happen.
Okay, we are out of time. I want to thank so many of you for sticking with us through to the end. I would remind everyone to take a look at the event that is happening tonight. It's in the comments or in the chat window, and that will be both live streamed and in person. And in addition, the Center for European Studies will have another event on the 16th of March at noon, same time, and we will be circulating information on that as well. Same topic, different lineup of excellent speakers. So I want to thank everyone. It's a very difficult time and a very difficult subject, but I think the best that we can do is to try to help contextualize it for people and to help people to get a better understanding of what it is and why it is. So thanks everyone very much.
Thanks a lot, Amie, again.
Bye for now. Thanks.